when history suddenly opens its eyes. We are often told that history is buried silent, finished, and untouchable. But what if history could suddenly look back at us? What if the greatest evidence of a miracle was not a religious story at all, but an encrypted record waiting for nearly 2,000 years until humanity invented the language needed to read it? On the night of May 28, 1898, in Turin, Italy, photographer Secondo Pia stood frozen inside a dark room. As the image slowly emerged on a glass plate, his hands began to shake, nearly dropping it to the floor. Not because he saw a corpse, but because he saw an impossibility. The ancient linen cloth before him was behaving exactly like a photographic negative, a perfect inversion of light and shadow produced centuries before photography had ever existed. It is easy to dismiss the Shroud of Turin as medieval devotion or religious art, but the data demands a more unsettling conclusion. This is not merely a relic. It functions like a forensic record, a high-resolution imprint of trauma, sealed in time, waiting for modern science to unlock its meaning. The question is no longer whether you believe the story. The real question is this: what kind of energy could record three-dimensional information onto fragile linen without ink, without pigment, and without the hand of an artist? To answer that, we must leave the sanctuary and enter the laboratory and begin not with belief, but with the human body itself, an anatomical truth sacred art was never brave enough to imagine. In the biblical tradition, an image is never the destination. It is a map to a deeper truth. For centuries, the Renaissance masters gave us a golden standard for the crucifixion nail wounds positioned perfectly in the center of the palms. This is the Christ we expect to see. It is the icon we have grown comfortable with, but the Shroud of Turin offers a brutal correction to our religious imagination. It presents data so anatomically wrong by medieval standards that it becomes the most provocative artifact in history. Imagine a forger in the year 1350. To succeed, you must match the public's expectations. Would you dare to place the wounds in the wrists, a move every bishop and artist of your time would call a clumsy error? Of course not. A forger seeks safety. The shroud chooses forensic defiance. While the original biblical word for hand is linguistically vague, artists for 1,500 years almost unanimously chose the palm. Why does the shroud stand alone? Because modern biomechanics reveals a chilling reality. The palm cannot support the weight of a human body. The tissue would tear in minutes. Only the space of destot in the wrist possesses the structural integrity to hold a body on a cross. The shroud ignores our emotional piety and adheres strictly to the physical laws of an execution. It forces us to ask, does a saving truth need to be beautiful, or must it first be undeniably real? Look closer at the hands on the cloth, and you will notice another anomaly. The man has no thumbs. Why would history's most sophisticated forger forget the most essential part of the hand? The answer is found in neurology. When a spike is driven through the wrist, it strikes the median nerve. This triggers an involuntary reflex jerking the thumb into the center of the palm. The Bible remains silent on these physiological details because its purpose is to convey the meaning of the sacrifice, not the mechanics of the trauma. Yet the shroud records a specific neurological signature that was not understood until the 19th century. If this is a forgery, we are looking at the work of a master who ruined the aesthetics of his art to satisfy a science that hadn't been invented yet. Fold your own thumb into your palm right now. Feel that tension. That is the silent record of a specific Gagania data point hidden in these fibers for 2 millennia. But if these are merely anatomical curiosities, the next layer of the mystery pushes us beyond biology altogether. Even a master of anatomy requires paint. Yet under the microscope of modern science, the art theory begins to collapse. We are moving from anatomy to physics to a spatial code that should not exist on a flat surface. We are talking about 3D data encoded in an ancient cloth. In the world of theology, we call them akeiropoiete images not made by human hands. For centuries, this was a mystical claim, but under the lens of modern physics, it has transformed into a haunting forensic reality. We are forced to shift our focus from who made this to a much more disturbing question: what physical laws were suspended to allow this image to exist? Every masterpiece in history is created by adding mattering pigment or brushstrokes. But the Shroud of Turin presents a massive cognitive shock. The image has no material substance. Under a microscope, there is no paint, no dye, and no trace of biological or mineral pigment. Instead, scientists found a scorch-like discoloration caused by the dehydration and oxidation of cellulose fibers. This effect exists only on the absolute topmost layer of the linen, a layer so thin it measures just 1/100th the diameter of a human hair. To understand this level of precision, imagine using a laser to singe the fuzz off a peach without ever touching the skin underneath. This degree of controlled energy is light years beyond the technical reach of any medieval artist. This mystery extends far beyond a two-dimensional surface. In the late 1970s, NASA scientists processed the shroud through a VPE-8 image analyzer, a tool designed to map the 3D topography of other planets. They discovered a profound intellectual anomaly. The image behaves as if it possesses spatial awareness. Unlike a standard 2D photograph, which becomes a distorted mess when rendered in 3D, the shroud contains an embedded spatial code. The intensity of the image is strictly proportional to the distance between the body and the cloth, allowing for a perfectly proportioned 3D reconstruction. This proves that the image intensity follows a rigorous geometric law, a feat that no artistic technique of that era could have possibly encoded onto a flat piece of fabric. This evidence leads us to the most controversial, yet most persistent hypothesis: a burst of radiant energy. To print an anatomically perfect structure onto linen without bleeding or distortion, the body within the cloth seemingly emitted an intense flash of light lasting only a microsecond. It was powerful enough to record its own image into the fiber, yet delicate enough to leave the fabric itself intact. Here, science is describing a mechanism of quantum physics, while theology is naming the event. Science calls it a radiant burst. The apostles called it the resurrection. But that radiant energy wasn't the only thing left behind. When the pulse of light faded, it left minute physical traces that history now uses to betray our skepticism. Hidden within the light are microscopic witnesses, dust and pollen grains waiting to reveal a single specific coordinate on the map of the world. In systematic theology, we often sanitize the resurrection, treating it as a safe, abstract doctrine, a symbolic triumph of hope in the minds of the apostles. We place it in the realm of the purely spiritual, carefully detached from the messy laws of the material world. But the New Testament never describes the resurrection as an idea. It describes it as a historical explosion and event that left a vacant tomb. Transformed, broken men, and fundamentally reordered human history. The Shroud of Turin forces us to confront an even more radical possibility. What if the resurrection was the most violent and transformative physical event ever recorded? To understand this, we must look through the lens of modern physics. To produce an image with such forensic accuracy, without the use of ink or pigment, researchers have been forced to propose a mechanism that sounds like science fiction, a high-intensity, short-scale, radiant phenomenon. Imagine a burst of light occurring in less than a millionth of a second. It would have to be powerful enough to scorch the image into the fibers, yet so instantaneous that it left the linen intact rather than turning it to ash. Science is describing a physical process that defies classical modeling, while Scripture is naming the source, the light of the world. Science can describe how the light occurred. Theology tells us who that light is. Think of it this way. Imagine standing in total darkness when a high-intensity flash erupts for a millisecond. It doesn't burn the room, but it leaves the after-image of every object burned onto your retina. The shroud acts as the retina of history, capturing the lingering ghost of a moment where time itself seemed to pause. Now step inside that cold Jerusalem tomb. By every natural law, death has a predictable script decay. Matter breaks down, and fabric absorbs the stains of corruption. But the shroud records a different ending. The body within did not succumb to rot, nor was it stolen or unwrapped by human hands. In the absolute silence of that tomb, the body underwent what St. Paul calls a glorification, a transition, where it remained continuous with the old form but was no longer limited by it. It became RCR brilliant to the point of translucence. It passed through the linen like light through a crystal, and in that moment of crossing over, it left a radiant signature, a photographic negative of life itself, before vanishing from the visible world. If this cloth is genuine, it is not a gravestone. It is a message encoded in energy. It suggests that resurrection is not the resuscitation of a corpse, but a transition to a new state of being. The Shroud of Turin doesn't ask for your blind faith. It demands a better explanation. It forces us to acknowledge that something extraordinary occurred between the moment of death and the disappearance of the body, an event that permanently altered the molecular structure of the cloth. Death leaves the mark of time and decay. The resurrection, if it truly happened, had to leave the mark of time coming to an end. But while radiant energy is difficult to measure across 2,000 years, dust is forensics. When the great light faded, it left behind minute material witnesses. Microscopic traces of the desert trapped in the fibers are waiting to reveal a specific set of coordinates on the map of the world. We are moving from the radiant to the tangible, from the theology of light to the forensic reality of the soil itself. Science can help us ask how this image was formed, but it will never be able to answer the deeper question, who the Shroud of Turin remains suspended between two worlds, caught between the blinding white light of the laboratory and the paralyzing sacred silence of the chapel. It does not preach. It does not persuade. It does not demand your belief. It simply stands there unchanged and unexplained, challenging the world to look closer. And perhaps that is what makes it so unsettling. Because if the shroud truly functions as a masterfully encoded negative, then history is not the final image. You are. Your life becomes the positive print exposed to the light of whatever reality left its trace on those fibers 2,000 years ago. The final question is not about linen or radiant energy. It is about you. When you look into that silent face, do you see a forgotten corpse forever sealed by death? Or do you see something far more dangerous, a hope that refuses to stay buried? That is what history has left behind. Now we want to know what you think. Share your perspective in the comments below. Whether you are a skeptic or a believer, a scientist or a seeker, we read your thoughts and we learn from them. If you value these conversations where faith, history, and science are examined with depth and intellectual honesty, consider subscribing to the channel. Join us not necessarily for easy answers, but for better questions. Because some witnesses never speak, yet somehow they still change everything.